Yeah, we have panelists from all over this time.
Yep, all over the state, all over North Florida. Not just gardening in the Panhandle today. Bay County, Jax. All right, Gulf Breeze.
Leon, woohoo!
Yeah, in the state capital, Okaloosa. Is it rainy and foggy everywhere else today too? It is here in Bluntstown.
It's cleared up and it's kind of chilly here in Tallahassee.
Yeah, it is pretty chilly.
Diffuniac. Beautiful little Diffuniac.
Nice to see you, Judy. It's been a while.
Daniel's been good about, oh, that's you, Bluntstown.
Yep. All right. Well, it is 12 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, officially, everybody now. And welcome to Gardening in the Panhandle Live Selecting and Maintaining Landscape Trees Edition. We're very glad that you've joined us today. And we really have quite a show for you. I think for today's topic, we've assembled an awesome panel to answer everybody's questions in Zoom land and on Facebook. So let's go ahead and introduce everybody. So I'm going to start on my screen from the top left and work my way down. Larry Williams, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great and appreciate the opportunity to participate in this.
Awesome. Larry is a horticulture agent over in Okaloosa County. We have Mark, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Mark Tancig, horticulture agent in Leon County, and I'm doing well, Daniel. Thank you.
Happy to have Mark in there. Tallahassee has some beautiful trees, so I'm sure we'll hear some expertise today. And down to the left of me is Larry Figart, a newcomer to Gardening in the Panhandle Live. Larry, tell us hello.
Good afternoon, Larry Figart. I'm the Urban Forestry Extension Agent in Duval County, which is Jacksonville. So I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. Just to the right of Larry is our good friend, Matt Orwat. Hey, Matt, how are you today?
Excellent. Excellent. I'm happy to be here. And I love talking about trees, especially since our county sustained a lot of Hurricane Michael damage.
That's
so
right.
We had a lot of tree talk around here the last few years.
Absolutely. And the second of our super special guests today, Dr. Ryan Klein. Ryan, how are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me. So I'm the new assistant professor of arboriculture on the main campus at University of Florida. Happy to be here.
So that's the position used to be held by Ed?
Yeah, Dr. Gilman, yep.
If anybody out there has seen a publication or read a publication by Dr. Ed Gilman, Ryan is now in that position, and we're super glad to have him on today. So now that we know everybody, let's go ahead and dive in. And so the first question we're going to do, just want to get a couple of y'all's thoughts. This is a question we've gotten from several people and all of us in our jobs here all the time. So we'll start with Ryan. Ryan, the question is, what is the #1 mistake folks can make in your mind when planting trees?
Well, I would say even before planting the tree is not inspecting the nursery stock for quality. So you want to make sure there's no root defects that persisted, through the nursery process. A lot of times you'll see, if you're buying a larger tree, you'll see imprints from smaller containers. And once you plant that tree into the landscape, that imprint from, your 1 gallon, 3 gallon container essentially is going to prohibit the roots from getting out into the landscape soil. So when you have, extreme wind events like hurricanes, even some of our common winds that we have, 40, 50 mile an hour, those trees are the ones you're typically going to see that fail, the ones that have the root defects. And then once you do get them in a landscape, just make sure you're planting them into a space that's appropriate for the size of the species at maturity.
Okay. Does your research have to do with this topic?
I'm dabbling a little bit in some of it, either directly or indirectly related to other things. But yeah, I do some stuff with hurricanes.
Okay, gotcha. Larry, what would be a big mistake that you would say occurs commonly when planting trees?
So Daniel, today you got to say Larry Williams or Larry Figart. So
we're going Figart today.
Okay. So in addition to what Dr. Klein said, for sure inspect the tree and get the right good quality tree. But one of the things I enjoy talking about is planting it at the right depth. I wish I could claim it as my own, but I had a forester friend of mine that said, plant it high and it won't die. So if you remember that along with leaves of three, let it be, and red on yellow, kill a fella, and plant it high and it won't die. And so that's leaving a little bit of the root ball out of the ground, because as the worst mistake is to plant it deep. And so with the materials that most of our containers are growing in, it's not real soil, so it rots and it settles. So over time, that tree will set. If you plant it a little high, it'll settle at the right depth.
Awesome. That's a good one. I know that's near and dear to Julie McConnell's heart. She's seen that with a bunch of palm trees in their county. Mark Tancig, you got any kind of wisdom you'd like to share with us about the number one mistake you see when planting trees that may be a little different than what we've heard so far?
No, I'm just going to kind of repeat what Dr. Klein said about making sure that when you plant that tree, hopefully the tree grows, right? Hopefully you plant it and it does well and it gets big.
Yeah.
And so, think of that mature size. So you don't put, a tree that gets 30 foot wide, 5 feet from your house type of thing. So just picking, thinking of that mature size and being sure that you plan for that growth.
Nice. Matt Orwat, Larry Williams, y'all got any mistakes to add to that are real common that you see?
See, sometimes depending on the tree species, I see people planting at the wrong time of the year. So planting a shade tree at the heat of the summer, or planting a citrus tree in the fall or winter when it could get cold damage. Those are the two main things I see.
Gotcha. Larry?
Yeah, I think people need to realize they're planting the future when they plant trees. Everything that goes with that tree is packed into that tree genetically, including the width and height. So we talk about the ground, but you need to look up as well and see if there's any power lines. A tree that's genetically designed to grow 60, 80 feet in height doesn't work too well underneath a 20-foot power line.
Right. I hear you. Well, the good news is now we've heard all we need to hear, and we can end today's webinar, right? Those are all really good tips for the mistakes that are made at the beginning. Planting trees will haunt the tree the rest of its life. So get those things right and you'll be good to go. So now we're going to dive in a little bit to tree selection. We'll get to the fun part here. And we're going to start with Ryan. So Ryan, this is a question from one of our Zoom listeners. And this person asked, I would like to hear about, this is an all too common thing, fast growing native trees that will create shade for my yard. We always want shade and we want it now.
Yeah. And so some of my favorites, and depending on what your position is on them, some people love them, some people don't.
Okay.
Sycamores, they grow really well till about Tampa, then they start to struggle a little bit. So if you're kind of, Orlando or north, they usually do pretty well, put on a lot of growth every year. Some people complain they're a little bit messy, but one thing I like to say is, any tree can have its issues, but you want to make sure you're maintaining it. So as long as you do proper maintenance, specific to that species, you're going to be fine for the most part. The other thing I'm starting to see a little bit more of, at least in the Gainesville area, which I'm happy for, is the tulip poplar. Fast growing, nice, big, mature shade trees in, a relatively short period of time. Beyond that, you got your Shumered oaks, which depending on where you're at in the state, sometimes they have a little bit of trouble. If it gets too hot, they can struggle a little bit. Red maples, just make sure you get, a variety that does well in your area. Some of the Florida ones don't do as well the further south you get. Catalpa is another one of those I would put up there with kind of sycamore. Some people like them, some people don't. They're going to be better for the northern part of the state. And then river birch, similarly, kind of northern part of the state. Further south you get, they start to struggle.
Okay. That's
a good answer.
Quick growing.
Really well around here in the Panhandle.
Yeah, pretty nice list of quick growing native trees. Thanks for that. So Matt, you chimed in, so we're going to go to you here. This question is from a Zoom listener. The best tree in dry soil for a yard, and specifically, do you think elms would be good in this situation?
Okay, let me talk about that here for a second, because I did a little research on this, and for the Panhandle, I'm going to give this answer for the Panhandle. I would say if you are anywhere near the coast, I think the best one, or even in the sand hills around, say, the central Panhandle counties like Okaloosa, Walton, Washington, Jackson, you would be good to plant the sand live oak. Okay. We put the, I put that in a link for the sand live oak in the chat for a dry area. And I think that would be a good choice because it does love moisture, but it can also survive extreme drought. And if you're in a really, really sandy, dry soil, that would do well. Some others that you might think of that I see a lot growing in the sandhills would be turkey oak. They are kind of slow growing, but and most of the drought tolerant species would be slow growing because they regulate their growth in response to lack of water. But the turkey oak does pretty well, even though it does stay small. And I noticed that that also Larry posted in the chat. He mentioned the chestnut oak. That might be a good option for a dry area. As far as elms go, elms usually like more of a wetter soil. And our native elms, we have the winged elm and of course the American elm. Now, the American elm is not very common due to Dutch elm disease. However, you do still see it in bottomlands from time to time. And the American elm likes wet soil and a lot of moisture. And I think the winged elm is the same way. You do see some non-native elms like the Chinese elm and some of these Drake elms. And I think they do okay. They can do okay in dry areas, but I personally don't care for the way they look when they get older, and that their chances of blowing over or dropping limbs when they get old is not really the best. So I would personally not go with an elm. I would try to go with one of the other trees we mentioned here. And if Larry could chime in and talk about because I was not aware that the chestnut oak was adaptable to dry situations. So with the porous sand. So would Larry like to chime in on that?
So I was answering the question that was put in there about what are some of the favorite trees. So that's
Oh, okay.
Different.
I was not. Okay, good. Okay.
Thanks for your answer, Matt, and thanks for Larry.
Thanks.
Ryan, do you have any experience with elms and drier soil?
Not so much, but the one thing I was gonna say about elms is that I've been noticing in a lot of places where they're planted heavily. Savannah's got quite a few neighborhoods where they're planted pretty heavily. There's some cities in Florida, they're starting to pop up. Volunteers are starting to pop up. So not to say that they're, invasive, but there's definitely, a chance that maybe, some of the species or the varieties could head that direction. Just, given what I'm seeing, it's anecdotal right now, but that's what I'm just kind of seeing with them.
Dr. Klein, talking about the Drake elms or the Chinese elms?
Yeah, Chinese, lace bark.
We're not talking about our native elms.
Okay. So just be careful using those elms, but could be an option for you there.
My opinion is we have so many great native trees in Florida for shade. I would just stick with our natives. Now, of course, there are a lot of small, medium-sized shrub trees like Crape Myrtle and Laura Petalum and Podocarpus that are not native, and they're all great. But for a big shade tree, we have a ton of great natives. So I'd say stick with those natives.
Totally agree. Good point on that. Larry Figart, all the way over there in Jacksonville. I'm going to get you to answer this question for me. This is a very broad question, but we get it a lot. We kind of live in an interesting spot where we don't have a ton of chill hours, but we're also a little too cold for a lot of the tropical stuff. So what are some good fruit trees that can thrive for us in our landscapes in North Florida?
So I've been at least in our area, we've got a lot of citrus greening. So I've been putting a lot of thought because generally they'll call on the phone and they'll fruit tree and I'm thinking something else and they're automatically fruit is citrus.
Yep.
But so I've been putting a lot of thought into maybe some alternative trees to citrus. And so I've come up with Oriental Persimmon. They grow very well with hardly any inputs. You can actually over fertilize them very easily. They don't like a lot of fertilizer. Loquat, when I was growing up, I used to think it was weedy until somebody made me eat one, and then I love them. I just graze all the time.
They're so good.
Yes, they are. I'll just say this really quick. I had a story guy call me up with a heavy Middle Eastern accent, and he said he had Barcelona plums. I'm like, what are they? So I went to go see him, and don't do this, anybody, but he brought seeds over from Barcelona, Spain. and planted them in his yard, and they were loquats, and I promise you they were this big. And so there are some cultivated varieties of loquats that are bred to be a little bit bigger, not your
You gonna get us some
size.
seeds or something, Larry?
Say that
Yeah.
again?
You gonna get us some seeds or
I'm gonna
what?
try some of those seeds.
No, I'm not doing, no. But there are named cultivated varieties of loquats that you can look for. Oriental pears have been around in Florida for a long time. They're kind of hard. So they're cooking pears. Sometimes people call them sand pears, but they do very well. Lower chill. You guys in the Panhandle have a few more chilling hours than we do in Jacksonville, but low chill peaches and plums. If you can, maybe we'll talk a little later about pruning, but they have to be pruned in a certain way, but they're very good. And then to round it out, figs. And then we actually have a farm here in Jacksonville where they're growing mayhaws, strictly for the juice. So they grow them and juice them, and then they actually use those mayhaw juices in adult beverage cocktails. So they found a niche for the mayhaw juice.
All right, those are some excellent options that you don't think about all the time. So good deal, Larry. And just echo what you said. We're having some citrus screening pop up here and there. So looking at some of those.
Hey, Daniel, can I chime in one thing on Larry's thing?
Quickly.
Yes, on the Japanese persimmon or Oriental persimmon, you want to make sure it's grafted onto native rootstock, native Florida rootstock.
Good point. Thank you, Matt. Larry Williams, let's go over to Okaloosa County for this question. What are some good native trees to go under tall established pines?
Okay, there's quite a list, and I think mostly of those will handle some shade and that don't grow extremely large.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna throw a few of those out there, and there is a link. The link is actually designed for trees to grow under power lines, but some of these that I mentioned are on that list. When you pull up that link and you pull up individual publications with more information. But there's one that, and I should say that availability is a big deal. We can throw out names of trees, but good luck sometimes finding them. And the first one I'm gonna mention, most people aren't aware of, but it's called Stewardia. Sometimes common name, that's the genus Silky Camellia. It is a really nice native small tree. You could consider it a large shrub, but it's one that's difficult to find, unfortunately, in the nursery trade. And that one, by the way, is 12 to 18 feet in height. Kyananthus, the Grancy graybeard fringe tree, our native tree, that is gorgeous in late winter, early spring. Certainly an option. The red buckeye, we do have a native buckeye.
Yeah.
And that one is 15, 20 feet in height at maturity. A more common tree is the eastern redbud would definitely be a possibility underneath some tall pines. Our flowering dogwood, the native dogwood, Cornus Florida, but we are seeing some problems with it. So I'm not recommending it as much as I used to. And our local forester is contributing some of the problems that we see, not just from her observation, but they actually, I think, pulled in some people from FDACS with the climate issues and not getting as much cool weather during the dormant season for the Florida dogwood. The flowering dogwood may be an issue or contributing factor for some of the problems we're seeing with the dogwood right now. Our native hawthorns, Crataegus, underused, good option. There's a number of tree forms, hollies like the Savannah, Dahoon, that I would consider. A vaccinium in the blueberry family would be the sparkleberry, makes a small tree. Another one that's just wonderful. One that
Lots of good options.
Then the ashy or ash, I pronounce it ash magnolia, the big leaf magnolia is a native tree that is very much underused. Pawpaw could provide you some fruit and handle those conditions underneath tall pines. So those are some that I would consider.
Awesome. Thanks, Larry. Ryan, I hate to jump to chase a rabbit, but could you touch on the dogwood issue real quick? Because I do hear that from a lot of clients that dogwoods just don't do great anymore. Could you
Yeah, and I don't know
that
if
is?
I can give you a definitive answer to that, but the one thing I will say from
Yeah.
just my experience, I've been in Florida for 7 years now. Most of the dogwoods that I've passed over the years in neighborhoods, I've seen them, go through these stages of looking pretty poor to where, the next time I go by, a lot of them are gone. They've been removed. But yeah, they just don't seem to do too well, at least Gainesville South. I can't speak to the Panhandle, but yeah, it seems like it's probably related to, warming climates. And then, some of it's probably related to site conditions. When you get those smaller, poor urban sites where these trees kind of struggle once they get to a certain age, certain size, you start to see a little bit of decline.
Yeah, so probably not one definitive single answer. It's a
Combination of things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Mark Tancig, I know you've been chomping at the bit there to get to this. Mark, this is an important question. I need Mark Tancig's top 5 native trees for fall color.
All right.
List.
Well, fortunately, I got an answer for you, and I got Larry Williams to back me up because I found a great article that Larry put together.
He really did.
We're going to share that in the link with y'all, but okay, are you ready for the top 5? Do we need a drum
I'm ready
roll
for
or
Mark
anything?
Tancig's top 5 best
All right.
of all time for
Black
fall color.
gum. Black gum, which is a species of Nyssa. It's related to your tupelos. Black gum has got beautiful color and it's got really great branching. The branches are very kind of like at right angles from the stem, from the trunk. We have sweet gum, which like the sycamores, some people are going to curse at sweet gums, but sweet gums actually have beautiful fall color. And those annoying little fruits that fall, are really great for wildlife. So that's a good tree. We have cypress. So we're going to talk more about cypress knees here in a little bit, but cypress is a great native tree. And right now in Tallahassee, they are just looking gorgeous. The cypress trees are turning colors. They look really good.
Kiss.
That's 3 of them. Let's see. Number 4, I got red maple. So we mentioned red maple earlier. Red maple is got beautiful color. I planted a bare root one a couple of years ago. It's only maybe 6 feet tall now, but it's even the little tiny red maple is still kind of showing some pretty hues. And then the last one is hickories. So my favorite in Tallahassee is the mockernut hickory.
Okay.
The mockernut hickory gets really great yellow color, but even your pignut hickory, mockernut hickory, both kind of available in the landscape trade. Those would be my top 5.
Okay. Excellent list. There you have it, folks. The definitive fall color list for Mark Tancig.
Mic drop.
Ryan, another important question here that we get a lot, especially in urban areas, and I'm sure Larry has dealt with this a ton in Jacksonville. And so, are there lists available for appropriate sidewalk trees based on soil volume? We have a lot of trouble with sidewalk cracking and all of that. So, maybe what are some good trees to plant? Where sidewalk lodging is an issue.
Yeah, so I'm not even going to address which trees you should plant because it all depends on the size space. But what I will say is in the last probably 5 years, there's been a couple of research articles that have come out and addressed, minimum planting widths. And essentially what it's based off of is the trunk flare diameter at maturity, and then a certain amount of space that you need on each side as a buffer. So Dr. Kozer from the University of Florida and Dr. Hilbert, who she has a consulting firm right now, they did some studies on this. And essentially, just to give you an example, so a live oak at maturity up to 69 inches diameter needs at least 16 foot. So obviously, we're not seeing a 16-foot planting strip, next to any of the roads that, I've been by. And then to take it to, a smaller species like Crepe Myrtle, for an 8-inch Crepe Myrtle at maturity, you need at least 3 foot. And I've seen some Crepe Myrtles crammed in some small spaces. Yeah, they look fine. But ideally, that's what you need.
Right.
So they actually came up with a list of minimum planting widths for probably about 40 or 50 species. And then outside of that, I've noticed some municipalities in their codes have some recommendations for minimum planting widths. And some of them get down to the species level. Others say, shade tree, understory trees, stuff like that.
Okay.
But so, essentially, it depends on how much space you have is kind of what species, you might lean towards. But just think of it this way: the bigger the tree, the bigger the space you're going to need.
Yeah. And probably as a general rule, most folks underestimate the amount of space they're going to need, I would guess.
Yeah. And when you put a large growing tree in too small of a space, it's going to lead to early decline, premature death, potential hazards, wind throw, stuff like that. Because when you're watching, we have a hurricane come through, most of the trees that you see that have, failed, and I'm not talking just like branches and stuff, but whole tree failure.
Total failure, yeah.
Yeah, it's usually small planting spaces surrounded by impervious surfaces, trees too big for the space, and it just pulls up the whole root plate. So
makes total sense. Great answer. All right, Larry Figart, our urban forestry agent. There's not a lot of those in the state, are there? One of two. So folks, we've got one of two here today, so you should feel blessed. Larry, what can you tell us about the viability of ginkgo trees in North Florida in general and the Panhandle specifically?
So it's not a common tree that's planted, and so just a few things about ginkgos is there. You want to make sure that you get a cultivar that's from a male tree. Now we did have, I have gone to a few places where they've just planted a ginkgo and it grows up, and what happens is the fruit that a female ginkgo would produce actually smells like rotten meat. Ooh. And so, it's bad, but the fortunate thing about that is it takes about 18 to 20 years for that to occur. So these folks have this tree, it's looking nice, and then all of a sudden it starts spewing these very messy
odors,
so
aromas.
So just make sure it's a male cultivar. They're not very common. The thing I would think about is moist. There's always kind of a conundrum with soil, and it's moist, well drained. It's like, well, what does that mean? It just means soil that is watered frequently enough, not overwatered, but not super dry and not super wet. And then it's kind of I don't want to say a hit or miss, but it's kind of a science experiment. I've seen some do really well, and I've seen some not do well. Just a quick thing. I think it was at Canapahaw Gardens in Gainesville. They've got some really, really nice ginkgos growing there. So it can occur. It's just not a common thing.
Yeah, I've got some gardeners here, around the area that have a couple that are really pretty, and I've planted one that just didn't do it for me.
We have one here at our demonstration garden that I planted maybe 5 years ago. That's looking pretty good. They get amazing burst of yellow.
Yeah.
But you better catch it when it happens, because within a couple days it goes from beautiful yellow to everything's on the ground.
And Ryan, we love ginkgos, but probably at the very far south end of its range, I would guess.
I have one at my lab that, if I was to guess, it's probably about, I don't know, maybe 8-10 inch caliper.
Yeah.
And they're slow growing. Like Larry said, you want to avoid the female ones, and not only the smell. I used to, in my spare time as a youth, I used to build a lot of patios and retaining walls and stuff just on the side. And they will stain concrete, the seeds will. So that's another thing you got to be careful of, because I've seen them buy some patios. But yeah, I think North Florida is probably close to the southern range. The ones I have seen, and I haven't seen the ones at Canapahaw, but we have a couple on campus. The canopies are a little bit sparse compared to what I've seen up north.
Yeah.
Because I planted one up north probably 15 years ago, and a lot fuller canopy than what I see down here.
Okay, cool. It can be done. Just follow those tips that you just heard there. So our next question, we're going to go to Larry Williams. Larry, there's two oaks that have sort of risen in popularity in the Panhandle, the Nuttall oak and the Shumard oak. In your opinion, which of those provide sort of the easier to grow tree and the better fall color?
I've grown both. They're very similar in my opinion. That you do need to realize they are large maturing trees. I mean, they can grow, 80 feet in height, or even, taller than that. But that's going to be, again in the future. But they're very similar. They look very similar. both will end up with, for an oak, decent fall color. You usually get orange to reddish colored foliage. I don't know. Having experience in growing both of those trees, I can't say if I would really favor one over the other. I don't know if anybody else has an opinion on that. They're very similar in height and width, and they both have that orange to red, usually pretty consistent orange to red fall color.
I think the person should plant one of each.
There you go. Larry, Ryan, got any thoughts? One versus the other? They're very similar in a lot of aspects.
So the only thing, and this isn't a dig on either one of those, because I love Shumards and I love
Nuttalls.
Yeah, the Nuttall oak. And the Nuttall oak, they say you can plant it in a little bit wetter of a site, but I'm not, I haven't seen that one way or the other. But just that they're both in the red oak group. So the longevity might be 60 to 80 years versus hundreds of years. That's
Okay.
the only thing to think about that.
Ryan?
Yeah, the only thing I would
thoughts?
add is that as far as the Shumards go, I've seen some really nice ones and I've seen some atrocious ones. And typically the ones that look really bad are the ones that are in that small planting space. You see a lot of dieback, you see people having to hack away at them, and then they kind of get more of this decurrent form rather than a nice central leader, and they're more prone to failures and wind events, stuff like that. So just with any large trees, make sure it's going in the right space. But the ones that I've seen open grown, they look really nice.
Yep. I've only had one failure with with Shumard oak, and it's like Larry Figart mentioned, on the edge of a black gum pond, and the water got up higher than it normally does and stayed there, and it did not make it. And a couple of the Nuttalls did. So just anecdotal evidence, maybe, the Nuttall is a little bit more tolerant of the water, but those are all great points. And I appreciate it.
Daniel, one other thing that probably goes along with a lot of other trees, but especially when these two trees are younger, they are relatively thin barked. So you need to be real careful with mowing equipment, string trimmers, lawnmowers. That can cause permanent damage for any tree. And in our landscape situations where you have grass, it's best not to have lawn grass growing right up to the trunks of trees anyway.
There you go. Good question. Good answer. Ryan, next question here. This is a pertinent one for the Panhandle, especially over the last couple of years with our history with hurricanes. What trees in your mind are good trees that are as wind resistant as we can get, within reason?
Yeah, so I'll preface this with, depending on how strong the storm is, even that live oak's potentially going to fail in a category 3 or higher. Some of the research that I've done, we found the live oaks, bald cypresses, Royal Point siennas, some ligustrum to be a little bit more resilient and have higher survivability levels. Your laurel oaks, your water oaks, some of your like weedier species, those are the ones that typically are more likely to fail. But that said, it's hard to just say just because it's this species, it's going to fail or it's going to survive. Comes down to previous maintenance. Was that tree ever structurally pruned? Was it just left to go?
Is it in one of those tiny planting spots?
Yeah, that site conditions. Any sort of pest disease. Basically, what we need to know when we're doing this hurricane research is essentially we need to know not only did that tree fail, so you can go in and look at it and see, okay, these species failed, and you can count them up, whatever. But what you essentially need is some sort of inventory, condition, like some sort of rating, be able to identify defects and other structural issues, the small planting spaces, to where then you can take that and then apply that information to the information you get after the storm, and then get some sort of meaningful, data out of it. But when you're just going and looking after the storm and saying, okay, these species were more likely to fail, there's a lot of variables you're missing. The other thing, besides I mentioned wind speed earlier, the amount of rain you get. So soil saturation, you're going to have slippage of the roots in the soil. And yeah, just the planting spaces, the quality of the nursery stock to begin with. Do they have any sort of root defects like I mentioned earlier? So there's a lot of things that go with that. You can have a species that, maybe we're going to find out down the road it's potentially more likely to fail. But if you take care of that tree from its onset, when you plant it, there's, a lot that could be said about, it might actually do better in the storm than a species that we find to be, a little bit more resilient. So yeah, just lots of things that need to be considered there.
Our classic answer, it depends, right?
Yeah, and I'll throw one thing out. So I think it was probably about 15 years ago, IFAS had, it was Dr. Gilman and Mary Duryea did Hurricane and Trees, a whole bunch of chapters, almost like a book or a pamphlet, and it was all online through EDIS. Myself, Dr. Michael Andrew and Dr. Andrew Kozer went through the process of revising that, updating some information, and basically all those chapters are going to be re-released on a website that's also going to have links to National Weather Service, other hurricane related information. There's going to be videos, pictures, just tons of it. We basically want to use this as a hub for trees and hurricanes. So it should be up and running probably by summer.
Cool.
But so I didn't put the link in the chat because it's not done yet. But once we get that out there, it'll be available to everybody, and there's gonna be a lot of good information, as far as up to date what we know now. But we essentially just need, more data sets,
More hurricanes to measure from, right?
Yeah, more wind speeds, more information.
Okay, some exciting research coming out of Dr. Klein's lab that we're pretty stoked to see come. We're gonna have a fun little interlude here. We're kind of at the midpoint of our little webinar, and I want all of you to give. I'm putting you on the spot. I want everybody on the panel to give me a tree. We're gonna do kind of a favorite and a least favorite. I want a tree that you wish was planted more and a tree you wish was planted less. And so I see the wheels turning in Mark Tancig's head. We're gonna start there.
Great. All right. Tree to avoid planting. I'm going to go with Crape Myrtle. I'm sorry. I know they're pretty, but they're planted too much, right? There's a lot of them. We got a lot of trees.
Plant less Crape Myrtles. What should we plant more
take
of?
a break from Crape Myrtle. I would say let's plant. I'm going to not be specific and just say let's plant more oak trees in general, because oak trees, let's do Quercus. Yeah, Quercus, the oaks. They are just so beneficial to wildlife that they're just worth planting more of them.
Great answer. Let's go to Matt Orwat. Matt, less planting, more planting. Give me two.
The least planted one I would like to see less of is, some people might hate me for this, but the Japanese Magnolia.
Okay.
Because I will tell you that even though I like the Japanese Magnolia, they tend to get a lot of scale.
Okay.
And they tend to not flower readily with our variable climate change. They tend to either, sometimes a frost gets the flowers before they bloom. So I think Japanese Magnolia should be used as like more of a hedge or a shrub.
So what should we plant more of?
I love the chinkapin oak.
Okay. Ooh, nice lesser known. So we've got two for the oak so far.
The chinkapin oak is a native, but it was eradicated mostly due to furniture production. Ooh. But it is native to the North Florida area.
There you go. Thank you. Larry Williams, you're going to make it three for the oaks. What should we plant more of? What should we plant less of?
Well, the bald cypress has been mentioned a little bit, I think, or maybe we talked about that before we started, but it's a native tree that I think is underused, misunderstood. It doesn't have to have swamp conditions, bog areas. It can grow on relatively dry sites if you make sure you water it to get it established that first year, 2, 3. And then the one that we need to quit planting, I think, is the Bradford pear.
Ooh, good answer. Like that. Larry Figart.
So least favorite would be either the two evergreen cypresses, Leyland cypress and Italian cypress.
Very good.
Because they got all these foliage issues. And then one very few people have ever heard, but it's my favorite tree ever. It's called the Hawthorn beam.
Oh.
But I discussed with a nursery, a wholesale nursery, and he says, well, you get me enough people to buy it and I'll plant it. So
there you go.
It's the chicken or the egg thing. And
this is a PSA for Larry's favorite tree. Go buy more of them.
Right. Yes.
All right, good deal. So Ryan Klein, which one should we plant more of? Which one should we plant less of?
So the more of a preface with, I'm originally from Chicago area. And so I really like the sweet gums, the sycamores, but one of my favorites that I don't know if it'll grow down here or not. I know the regular variety struggles, at least Gainesville South, but forest pansy red bud. So it's a red bud, but it has like burgundy leaves, still gets like that pinkish purple flower. And then the one that I want to see just completely blown up or cut down Lorax style is the Crape Myrtle. They do nothing for me. I'll put it this way. I don't mind them if you let them just grow, but when people start pollarding them and like, if you just let it do its natural thing, I don't mind them. But when they're highly manicured, I'm disgusted. Sorry.
Okay. That's great. So got us good things.
Strong
there.
words. Yeah.
Strong words for the Crepe Myrtle today.
Yeah.
All right. So I appreciate that, guys. That was fun. So let's move on to some miscellaneous maintenance questions from our viewers on Zoom. Larry, we're going to go to you first. You don't have to list a bunch, but just give us a couple of common diseases that will affect a lot of our native trees and kind of how to avoid them in just a few minutes here.
So the first one that I get the most calls on, and you would think, and I'm going to call it, it's a root disease. It's called mushroom root rot or armillaria. And so automatically people think it's wet conditions, but the time where I usually get the phone calls is in the beginning of the summer. Folks will, and it's usually the first hot spell of the summer, people's trees will die seemingly overnight. So they'll say it's dead, and you kind of dig around, and it's really a root disease called mushroom root rot, and it's had it for a while. It just, the tree got old enough, and the root rot took enough the roots away, and so the tree lost more water than it could take up with its diseased roots. So that's mushroom root rot, and I knew I was kind of sort of prepared for this. And so what you can do is, if you think you've got a struggling tree, is scrape the bark and look for that white mycelium. And so that's mushroom root rot.
Okay.
The next thing we see a lot of with holly trees, I'm not sure if it's gotten up to the Panhandle or not, but it's called spheropsis or witch's broom.
Okay.
And so with hollies, especially in commercial sites where folks come with these trimmers and just kind of make them into little Christmas trees, it's a disease that's spread by pruning tools a lot. Wet windblown rain will spread it like normal, but pruning tools spread it from landscape to landscape to landscape. And what that ends up being is a long, slow, painful, not that trees have pain, but long, slow, agonizing.
You don't know that.
Right. Agonizing death for a holly tree. It takes 10 years for it to happen, but it just gets worse and worse. Those are kind of the two big ones.
Okay, excellent. Clean your pruning tools. Great lesson from Larry Figart today. Mark Tancig. So our next question, Zoom listener here. I've got some 5-year-old trees. I presume they're established if they're 5 years old. Do I still need to water them when it doesn't rain?
Well, you took my answer away, Daniel. If it's a 5-year-old tree, and if you pick the right tree for the right place, by 5 years, if they're still alive, most likely those trees are established, meaning that they are, they've worked their roots out into the landscape, surrounding landscape, and they're working for themselves type of deal. So, I would say if it's a ornamental tree, that you're probably good. Maybe in a drought, you might want to give it a little bit of extra water, but otherwise you're probably fine. If it's a fruit tree, that is one where, it's kind of like vegetables versus ornamental shrubs and, perennials. You want to make sure that your food producing crops always have plenty of water, right? So if it's a fruit tree, go ahead and continue to kind of give it regular watering to make sure it's never kind of in a deficit. But if it's an ornamental tree, 5 years old in the ground, I wouldn't worry about it unless you're in a severe drought.
Awesome. So I'm going to go to Matt Orwat here. And our question, Matt, is going to be about cypress trees. And the question is, do cypress trees always develop knees? What say you, Matt Orwat? I think you are muted.
Do cypress trees always develop knees?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good question. They don't.
It is. That's why I asked it to you.
So I put some links in the chat and they can post those and read those. But The answer is no, because cypress trees in general will produce knees for two different reasons. Either that the soil is wet and they produce those knees to get some oxygen. So the soil is wet and or moist and they're pushing those out for that reason, or the soil is highly compacted and the root zone cannot get very deep. And so they're forcing themselves to put those knees up, especially if they have a clay layer pretty high up in the soil profile that's restricting the root system. And a lot of times that'll occur when some say an area has been developed on some poor fill dirt, and the fill dirt's really hard and compacted, that can occur. Or if we have a really shallow natural clay layer as well.
Awesome. I appreciate that answer. I will say, Larry Figart told me a few minutes ago he has never seen a cypress tree not produce knees. So yes and no. Good. All right, Ryan, got an interesting question here about overwintering and protection of young trees. So where, in the Panhandle, we do get some heavy frost from time to time. Do you need to protect newly planted or young trees from that?
So I'll be completely honest with you. I don't know the answer to this question.
Ooh.
My experience with trees and freezing up north is if you had them watered in really well, especially if it was newly planted, that typically did the trick. But if those trees had a dry root ball, that's when you'd run into issues. As far as down here goes, I've seen, we'd get some freezes in Gainesville and, some trees would just go that had been there, I'm guessing 20, 30 years. And then other years you'd have even worse freezes and, other trees of similar species wouldn't be affected. So I don't necessarily have the answer to that one. I know I've seen some stuff as far as micro sprinklers. If it's a smaller tree, you can cover it, soil blankets, stuff like that. But I don't know, depending on how hard the freeze is and the condition of that tree, it still might succumb to the freeze. I think there's a little bit of variability there.
Sure.
But then I want to circle back to one thing here that Larry said about trees don't feel pain.
Let's do it.
Most trees don't. Crepe myrtles do every day of their meaningless existence.
Oh, man. Wow.
Wow.
Today.
Boy, we do not have a Crape Myrtle fan here, do we? Oof.
Goodness gracious. Ryan, while we've got you talking here, and you're clearly on fire, what is the time frame for trees to become established? This is a question from Facebook. Is there kind of every tree is going to be a little different, but sort of a general rule? What could you tell us, listener?
Yeah, like most places in Florida, you're looking at 4 to 6 months. Okay. A lot of that has to do, with how well they're irrigated, how hot it is out, stuff like that, the soil they're being planted into. But based off the grades and standards for, I think it's a 2-inch caliper tree, you can expect like 4 to 6 months for most species.
Okay.
So bigger the tree, it's going to take a little bit longer to establish. So sometimes you might hear where, sometimes that when trees are planted, when they're smaller, they actually establish and put on more growth than, if you're planting a larger caliper tree, because it takes a little bit longer to establish in the landscape, and it can be stressed out slightly depending on the type of nursery stock, whether it's balled and burlapped or containerized, stuff like that.
Excellent. Very good. Matt Orwat, we get this question a lot too, particularly, where HOAs and things are present where they may require this, but just in general, should you completely remove fallen leaves, or should you just leave them and you let them mulch themselves? What are your thoughts?
The best case there is to let them lay and mulch over them with a mulching mower.
Okay.
If you mulch them several times, if they're really heavy, over the course of several weeks, they break down pretty quickly. And the other thing is, if you do decide you need to rake them, you could develop a compost with them, or you use them to mulch your landscape shrubs. But I would prefer to leave them on the ground and run over them with a mulch mower, because that builds your soil.
I love that answer. All right. Larry Figart, we had somebody ask in the chat earlier about fruit trees, and we're about to hit that again here. So we have a Zoom listener that wants to know, when is the right time to prune fruit trees in North Florida?
So I'll answer it the way I would answer the question here on the phone.
Pretend I've just called you up. Larry, when should I prune my fruit trees?
So, and it goes back to fruit trees sometimes means citrus. So I'll do both of those.
Okay.
Citrus is you prune them after you harvest the fruit. So, because pretty much they've got fruit or flowers most of the year, but after you harvest the fruit, then you get this little window and you can prune them. And how you prune them is you prune them just like you would any other tree. But then depending on the fruit, so deciduous fruit or temperate fruit like peaches and plums, there are really 2 times a year to prune them. One is after you harvest them, you do a little bit of shaping and pruning. And what that does is it keeps it from growing so much after you prune them in the winter, but then you kind of do a fine pruning in the winter when they're dormant.
Okay.
So those are 2 times. But then just one thing, people always talk about pruning peach trees. How do you do it? And so one of the easy things that I always, 2 things. One is, to me, they look like satellite dishes. So prune it to look like a satellite dish. But then I had a master gardener say, after we did a pruning workshop, and she said, oh, prune it like you want to put a beach ball in the middle. And so that made sense to me too. So those are just two little,
there you go,
factoids.
Peach is probably the most unusual pruning that we have to do for sure. So I appreciate that answer. That was awesome. We've just got a couple of questions here left that we'll get through. Got about 10 minutes, so we're right on time. I appreciate everybody for sticking with us, and we'll close out with a bang here in a couple of minutes. Larry Williams, this Zoom listener has a question for us. In my front yard, a magnolia and a longleaf pine are growing, in their opinion, too close together. Should I cut the pine and let the magnolia remain, or vice versa?
I think a big part of this is personal.
There's a lot of responsibility here. You're choosing for a tree.
I think a lot of this is personal preference. I have dealt with people over the years that just, they say, I would not have a pine tree in my yard, and they just don't like them. So, you know, some people enjoy pines. My personal preference, and this is without having the opportunity to see those trees.
Right.
But between the 2 types of trees, I would favor the magnolia.
Okay.
The magnolia needs plenty of room though, in both width, some height, but it needs a good bit of space for developing how wide that tree gets at maturity. I would, without having the benefit of seeing the trees, I would want to see the overall health condition of the trees. The age of the tree would have, you know, something to do with it. And yeah, that's the best I can give without being on site and actually seeing it. But my personal preference between the 2 would be, without knowing anything else about the trees, would be the magnolia, to keep the magnolia. Okay.
I like that. Personal preference, but if you want that magnolia to be big and full like it can be, the pine probably has to go. That's a good answer. Appreciate it. All right, Ryan, this is going to be, I know, a nuanced question. That's kind of a hot button topic too, but this listener wants to know, what is the impact of climate change on the longevity of trees in North Florida?
All right. And I want to circle back to what Larry said. So he says magnolia. Some people maybe say pine. I say keep them both, plant a Crepe Myrtle next to them. The next day, come back and cut it down. I'm kidding. Yeah, so the climate change thing, we're obviously seeing a bunch about this in the news. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just had their first summit, and I think it's been like 5 years or so. And they basically looked at all the information, the new research, and kind of put out these new recommendations and predictions based off of what they're expecting us to see by the end of the 21st century. And essentially we're looking at, you know, if we don't better our ways, somewhere between, you know, 2 and like 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit increase in surface temperatures, an increase in natural disasters, that's hurricanes for us, tornadoes, mainly, you know, in the Midwest, which I just found out recently, we're actually the 3rd highest frequency state for tornadoes in the US.
Sweet.
And then, you know, things like fires, we're seeing that out in the West. All these different things that are affecting our urban trees, pest, disease, are going to be increasing as well. So essentially it comes down to kind of what was alluded at the beginning of this by a couple of us, you know, planting the right tree in the right place. And then also looking towards the future. So we obviously know what does well here currently, but there's a little bit of research out there that has kind of looked at trees from outside of hardiness zones. And this is something that I plan to explore a little bit, but essentially the way climate change is predicted to work, at least here in Florida, we're going to see temperatures increasing, kind of shifting north and west. And we're also going to see less precipitation annually. So what we're wanting to do in these urban areas that already have these harsh conditions already for a lot of species is we're looking at species that maybe are coming from South Florida that could be planted, northern parts of the state that, based off of the predicted climate change are going to do, fine here as time goes on. So it's kind of like finding that happy medium. What's going to survive here now? What's also going to, persist in the future? And one thing I want to look at is species that are not currently being planted, ones that, have been identified as having some value in relation to climate change and also wind resistance, things that would be beneficial in our urban areas here in Florida. And I'd like to do some test plots of about 30 species and see if we can find some that, maybe we can incorporate into the landscape. It's going to take cooperation with growers and, industry professionals to kind of put together a list of these trees. But essentially, if we can get ahead of some of these things and plant some of these species out, then, maybe we won't lose substantial parts of our canopy, towards the end of the 21st century, like we're possibly going to do now if we don't change what we're doing. If we just keep planting the exact same species we're planting now, we potentially might lose large portions of our urban canopy.
That's an interesting thought. And y'all keep an eye out for Dr. Klein's research on the subject over the next however many years he's with us here at the University of Florida. Glad to have you in that position, Dr. Klein. And against my better judgment, I'm going to give this last question to Mark Tancig. Mark, the question is how to get pawpaw trees to bear fruit.
Patience, young grasshopper. It's a fruit tree, so you're going to want to make sure you're getting, what's going on with your soil. So make sure you got the right, pH, make sure you're providing regular fertilization. But we have some pawpaw trees here in our demonstration orchard. They've been in the ground, I think 7-8 years, and they struggle to put on, and we're regularly fertilizing them. When we do get 1 or 2 pawpaws to bear, the raccoons tend to get some of them before we do. So I would just be patient. I've heard a lot of excitement around pawpaws, but I've really yet to see one that was producing a whole bunch, and I was, able to eat several of them. So while you're waiting for your pawpaw to fruit, maybe plant a citrus tree, a fig tree, a persimmon tree. Larry mentioned persimmons. Those are one of my faves. So
Tide you over.
Yeah. And just wait.
I got an item. I've got something to add to Tancig here.
All right, let's hear it.
With pawpaws, they need a pollinator. So if they're not getting pollinated, you need to have a pollinator plant, a plant where it can pollinate from. And then also some people do hand pollination to make sure the flowers get pollinated. And the other thing is they like to grow in an area that mimics their natural environment, and they're understory trees and forests for the most part. So consider that as well. They might be in an area that's too sunny, so they're stressed, and then they're not deciding to produce any fruit.
Awesome.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to try that. You want to come over and hand pollinate ours?
Hey,
I don't mind. That might be fun.
Guys, I appreciate it. Y'all just dropped some great information on us today. And I'm going to go around the room here real quick, the virtual room, and just leave us with a thought for today on selecting and maintaining trees. Mark Tancig, what would you want to leave us with for this session today?
Plant more trees. We talked about climate change, and trees are really great at mitigating some of the effects of climate change because they're pulling carbon out of the air and they're getting it into their trunks, their roots. So just keep planting more, and think about trees might feel pain, or they might be able to send little signals that pain is happening to each other. So they might be more alive than we think.
There you go. Matt Orwat, what will you leave us with today?
I think my number one thing is to plant more unusual native trees because we use the same natives over and over. So look into what we have in the Florida Friendly Landscaping Guide, and what also not just that, but other tree books, and see what we have as native as options, especially with understory trees, but also make sure they're planted in the right area for the soil that we have, because we have such variable soils, and for the amount of sun, and just for the climate that we have. So research your natives, but plant more natives and plant more understory native trees.
Matt's message, get creative with your native tree planting. Very good. Larry Williams, give us a parting thought.
Anything that you can do to duplicate that tree's natural environment is only going to be beneficial. And that's difficult to do sometimes in an urban landscape, but I'm including mulch. You look at it in a forest situation, that natural layer of uniform mulch, anything that you can do to duplicate what that tree would have in its native habitat is only going to be beneficial if you can do that. My final thought is I do know what I am not going to buy Ryan Klein for Christmas. That is a Crape Myrtle tree.
The Crepe Myrtle's under the tree, under the proverbial tree.
I think we should all send them a postcard of Crape Myrtles.
Yeah. All right, Larry, I see you're chomping at the bits there. What are you going to leave us with today?
So just real quick, because we haven't talked about this maintenance here of codominant stems. So while your trees are young, you don't want this V to occur, because what happens is included bark and it becomes a weak branch attachment. So earlier the better, get rid of the codominant stem.
Ooh, I love Larry's visuals. Thank you, Larry. We loved having you on today.
I got a ton of them. My office is a fire hazard because of all the wood in here. So,
and Ryan, we appreciate you being on with us today. Leave us with a little wisdom.
Well, real quick to Larry's point there about the codoms, you don't necessarily have to remove them all the way back to the inclusion. If you just subordinate them, it'll slow the growth, and then it helps the overall structure. To the other Larry's point about not getting me crepe myrtles, I mean, if somebody gave me a crepe myrtle, I got plenty of ideas what I can do with it.
Yeah, he likes to cut trees probably.
And then the thing I'll leave you guys with today, so just keep in mind the management or mismanagement of our trees that we're currently doing as of today ultimately affects the health and survivability of those trees in the future. So just keep that in mind when we're planting these trees. Outside the fact that they're going to grow, if we're not doing some sort of regular maintenance, we're potentially setting ourselves up for future failures, or when we do have storm events coming through, high risk situations, liability, stuff like that. And not only do we have that aspect, but we're also losing the potential future benefits that tree could provide us with.
Awesome. Guys, I appreciate it today. To everybody out there, we had a blast doing this for you. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Please take our survey. Julie McConnell posted it in the chat just a minute ago, that ufl.qualtrics link. It does greatly help us. Let us know how we're doing, gives us ideas for future topics. You will not be seeing us in January. We are going to take the holiday and the month of January off. We will return with Gardening in the Panhandle live in February for a topic that will most likely be related to tomatoes. So if you're interested in tomatoes, be sure to join us in February. If not, we'll see you the next time. And please have a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays. And we appreciate it. Y'all have a good afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
See ya. Take care.
Everybody.